Next, we head to the Capitol's press briefing room for a press conference with the Republican candidate for Attorney General, Paul Schimpf. Mr. Schimpf discusses his campaign against current Attorney General Lisa Madigan and his positions on such issues as the war on drugs, pension reform, and concealed carry. This runs about 25 minutes.
All right, good morning and thank you for coming out today. I'm here this morning to announce another reason in our 14 Reasons to Trust a Retired Marine in 2014 program. Every 1 or 2 weeks from now until the election, I will announce a major policy or qualification difference between me and Lisa Madigan. The idea behind this program is to give the voters of Illinois a clear choice between two very different candidates for Illinois Attorney General. We are counting the reasons down. I guess that's David Letterman style. So 2 weeks ago in Chicago, we announced Reason 14, which was I can do a better job protecting your medical and financial privacy under Obamacare. This morning, I am announcing Reason 13. Reason 13 that you should trust me to be your next Attorney General of Illinois is I will work to ensure that pension reform complies with the provisions of the Illinois Constitution. Now, I am aware of the challenges our pension system faces. I recognize that our pension system must be reformed, otherwise the citizens of Illinois will be crushed under an avalanche of property taxes. But whatever solution we put forth must comply with the guarantees of the Illinois Constitution. Our senators and representatives had to take a tough vote on pension reform last November. They were assured by Speaker Madigan that the proposed reform was constitutional. Now, I'm not here this morning to throw spears at those who voted differently than I would have. Instead, I'm here to discuss the argument put forth by our current Attorney General for the constitutionality of that legislation. The first duty and loyalty of the Illinois Attorney General must be to the U.S. and Illinois constitutions. And Lisa Madigan has failed to perform that duty with respect to pension reform legislation. Our current Attorney General, in the brief she filed to the Illinois Supreme Court on the various pensions cases, has demonstrated that her loyalty is to the Madigan family legislative agenda and not to the Illinois Constitution. If you have read Lisa Madigan's briefs, you will agree that what follows is a fair summary of her arguments. Lisa argues that due to external circumstances, the Illinois pension system is severely underfunded. She continues to argue that this creates an emergency that jeopardizes the financial well-being of the state. My opponent claims that due to this emergency, the state of Illinois, under its sovereign police powers, has the right to ignore the pensions clause of the Illinois Constitution, and therefore the pension reform legislation is constitutional. Now, let's put aside the fact that the main cause of the pension's insolvency is not external circumstances, but the budgeting choices of the Madigan family and former Governor Rod Blagojevich. Let's also put aside the fact that one person's so-called emergency is another person's legislative opportunity, and it's very difficult for people to come to an agreement on what can actually constitute an emergency. I don't want to talk about those things. What I want to talk about instead is this dangerous idea that constitutional provisions do not apply during an emergency or a crisis. I completely reject this argument. Constitutional provisions apply at all times. In fact, the whole purpose of having a constitution is to protect us from politicians citing emergencies as the basis for dubious legislation. Think for a second about the mischief our government can cause if it gets to ignore our constitutional protections in the time of an emergency. By this logic, one could argue that the drug epidemic has become an emergency, and therefore we should be able to ignore the Fourth Amendment's provisions in order to facilitate police searches. Also, by this logic, one could argue that gang violence is out of control in Chicago. And then if you apply that logic, we could ignore the Second Amendment and confiscate all guns. So this idea that emergencies allow for the suspension of constitutional provisions is dangerous and must be rejected. So if this is the best that Lisa Madigan could do, if this was the best argument she could come up with to defend the legislation, she really had no business defending it. The last time I was here, I received a question about what was an example of Lisa Madigan's conflict of interest between her and her father. Well, we're not going to find a better example of her conflict of interest than this. Lisa Madigan's loyalty to her father's legislative agenda has precluded her from objectively assessing the constitutionality of the pensions legislation. We're all looking for bright-line differences in our candidates, and this is one. I believe the pensions legislation, the pensions reform legislation, was unconstitutional, and I would not have defended it, because I will not defend legislation that does not comply with the Illinois Constitution. If you elect me as your Attorney General, I will defend the provisions of the Illinois Constitution. I was not recruited by the Republican Party, and I do not owe allegiance to a legislative agenda. So if I'm elected our next Attorney General, my loyalty will be to the people of Illinois and the Illinois Constitution, not to the insiders and special interest groups. If you want an Attorney General who will work to ensure that pension reform complies with the Illinois Constitution, you need to trust me. You need to trust a retired Marine and not the Madigan machine. I'm happy now to take a few questions, both on topic and off. Thank you.
Paul, I heard you say the other day, perhaps it was on Dave's radio station or something, that is it the COLA that you think is not constitutional, reducing the COLA?
Yes, I think the COLA is clearly unconstitutional. The other provisions, you might be able to make an argument that they could pass constitutional muster, but the COLA is not. I believe that those are retirees that have already paid into the system. Their pensions have vested. They were relying on a promise that the state of Illinois made, and we need to keep those promises.
Okay. And this did pass the General Assembly with people using the preamble saying this is an emergency situation, therefore this is what we must do. So there's a lot of state legislators who are lawyers too. A lot of people obviously thought that this could pass constitutional muster using that argument. So isn't it just a matter of opinion?
Well, I think people relied on Speaker Madigan's assertion that this was constitutional. In the debate leading up to the passage of it, he assured everyone that it would be constitutional. However, when we trotted out the arguments for why it was, the only argument was that this is an emergency and that the state, under its police power, cannot or has the ability to ignore the pensions clause of the Constitution. It was during the last presidential administration that people were lighting themselves on fire, figuratively, over some in that administration made the argument that that the Constitution doesn't apply during time of war, and that I reject that argument, and I think most of the people of Illinois will reject that argument. Our constitutional provisions need to apply at all times. Any other?
Am I right that the argument is more from what's yours is yours, folks, but we're talking about changing the terms from this point on, that it's gone from that to not even establishing what's yours is yours? We might take that away from you too. I mean, hasn't the part that is being litigated shifted?
Well, the argument is, the pensions clause says that pensions cannot be diminished, and what's being argued now is that the terms of the pensions that people have relied on are not going to be kept the same. A reduction to the cost of living adjustment is a diminishment in the pension. There is absolutely no way around it.
Well, what about the Weems decision that the Supreme Court's treating health care benefits as much as protected as the pensions, even though health care benefits are not in the Constitution?
Well, the health care benefits were something that were included in the pensions plans. That case isn't directly on point with this pensions lawsuit that I'm talking about, but I did comment when that decision was rendered that the Supreme Court did recognize that pension plans include the health care plans. The pension rights can't be diminished, and I think that latest ruling from the Supreme Court really points out the fact that it looks like the Supreme Court is going to toss out toss out pension reform. Now, I don't know, anybody who tells you they know what the Supreme Court or knows what any court is going to do, obviously is just betraying their ignorance. I know what I would do if I were a Supreme Court justice, but I don't know what the Illinois Supreme Court's going to do. The latest decision, I think, makes it less likely that the Illinois Supreme Court is going to uphold this pensions legislation.
Just today in Detroit, which is bankrupt, largely because of their pensions, there's been an agreement where the pension recipients are going to take a cut in the pension benefits. So let's go back to the whole argument you're making. The first level, many people would argue, the first responsibility of government is to protect citizens. So under the Police Powers Act, if you have a society where the police functions are gutted because you're paying pensions, but you don't have the money for fire, let's say in police or state police, what's wrong with that argument? And would you try to help to work or support negotiating a voluntary cut in the current pension benefits level as per Detroit to allow the protection of all citizens and not just the benefit of those receiving public pensions?
Well, what I reject is the idea that the only way we can create solvency in our state is by cutting pension benefits. I believe that there are other states where the pensions are completely solvent, and the difference between those states and Illinois is the legislative choices that our legislators and our governors have made. I think it's a false choice to say that we have to cut the pensions in order to protect the state's solvency. And the problem when you say, well, it's an emergency situation, you can never agree on what an emergency is. There are people that did not agree with Speaker Madigan's assessment of the state of emergency that was included in the preamble of the bill. I would support if some of the unions representing the former pension holders, if they came to the table and were able to help negotiate a settlement that the union membership supported, I would be inclined to support that. But right now, to just reduce the cost of living adjustments, I think that's blatantly unconstitutional under the Illinois Constitution.
Well, the candidate of your party for governor, Bruce Rauner, has said repeatedly now that his solution to the pension problem would take the form of, even for current employees, up to this day working, you get the benefits that you have accrued, but from the next day forward, you would get something like a 401k or maybe something, a hybrid, but with a 401k as a major element of it. He says he's got lawyers, he's never produced them, who say that's constitutional. But if you're an employee and you've worked 28 years and you're hoping to work 35 and all of a sudden your pension is changed to a 401k from here on, do you think that's constitutional, what Mr. Rauner is proposing?
Well, I have not talked with Mr. Rauner about his pensions plan, so I don't want to comment on it when I haven't discussed the issue with him. I do know that if I'm elected Attorney General, I'm not going to be a rubber stamp for Bruce. Bruce wouldn't want an Attorney General who would be a rubber stamp, so I will be, formulating my position on pensions based on how I interpret the Illinois Constitution.
Yeah, how's it sound to you?
Well, something needs to be done. I don't think it is. I don't think it would comply with the Illinois Constitution if somebody has had significant reliance on the promises that the state made, and then the state didn't comply with those promises.
So it sounds like you just said you think that plan going forward.
Well, I'm not gonna make a comment on what his plan is. I really don't know what the specifics are of it, Bernie.
What about I was going to ask that same thing though, Paul. Forget Bruce Rauner. Just what about that principle? If you're working for me and I'm saying you're making X number of dollars a year, there's nothing to say that I can't say, because of bad business, I'm only going to be able to pay you 3/4 of what you were making going forward. What about that as a policy? Is that constitutional in your mind to say you've earned your benefits up to this point, but now we're going to change those benefits on a forward-looking basis, and you can stay employed with the state or leave?
Well, clearly, just the fact that you're hired by the state doesn't mean that from day one on the job you're guaranteed a pension. What concerns me with the constitutionality of the pensions fix, and why I've come out strongly saying that it's unconstitutional, is it applies to retirees whose pensions have already vested. These are people who are already retired and relying on the state of Illinois. And when you cut their cost of living adjustment, to me, that's breaking a promise by the state. A lot of these people are not eligible for Social Security, so that cost of living adjustment is important, and that's why I think that the COLA provision is clearly unconstitutional.
So you might be open to cutting pensions for those who are current workers, but are not.
I'd be open to assessing the constitutionality of that.
I just wondered if you had just said that clearly somebody who is hired from day one, they're not guaranteed a pension. How does that fit with your argument about the pensions are not constitutional, or I mean the pensions cannot be diminished? Right?
Sure. What I'm talking about is if you're hired, you can lose your job due to misconduct, and you don't rate a pension from the state of Illinois. And I'm most concerned that the thing that I think fails in the pension reform legislation is the COLA adjustments, the COLA cuts, which apply to people that had already done their time, had retired, and are now having a benefit cut.
But if you're vested, you get that's guaranteed, right?
Yes.
If you're vested into something.
Yes, ma'am.
On the same day as the Weems case, the Supreme Court also ruled that John Burge could keep his pension. Do you think that was a fair interpretation of the Constitution?
Well, I think that I'm not familiar with the specifics of that case. I remember just reading that the Supreme Court takes pension rights very, very seriously. That the Supreme Court believes that the pensions provision of the Illinois Constitution clearly matters. Yes, sir.
The Attorney General happens to be the child of the Speaker of the House. Thus, everything's suspect, because when Dad sneezes, the Attorney General wipes her nose. The same person who's Attorney General has discretion on what to and what not to litigate. Where does one stop and the other begin?
Well, I think you've basically identified the issue that Lisa Madigan, my opponent, does have a conflict of interest, and it's not because she's a good or a bad person. It's just because human nature, you're going to be loyal to your family, and the Attorney General needs to defend the state of Illinois unless the provisions are clearly unless the legislation in question is clearly unconstitutional. That principle is sound. And my opponent would agree with that. She refused to defend the state marriage laws when they were challenged, because she said that they were unconstitutional. What I'm saying this morning is I believe that the pensions reform legislation was clearly unconstitutional. If the best that Attorney General Madigan could do to try to defend it was to put forth this argument saying the constitutional provisions don't apply during an emergency, she shouldn't have defended it. So this is an area where this is a case where I would have done things differently than Attorney General Madigan.
Well, but, I mean, and that's great, because God invented 31 flavors, which is fine. I'm just wondering if she soiled the nest. Is that what you're saying? That there's nothing she can do that you can't say, well, not only would I have done something differently, but her dad's Speaker and mine's not. I'm just wondering how much of the argument that is when you said at the outset that it's a defense of the Madigan machine, a protection of the Madigan machine, versus your independent-minded quest for Attorney General.
That is the argument. I will be a more objective Attorney General whose loyalty is solely to the Illinois Constitution and to the people of Illinois. And her defense of this unconstitutional pensions reform is an example of how her family connections diminish her ability to be that objective Attorney General that the state of Illinois needs.
Will you drop the defense of this suit then if you become Attorney General?
It will depend on whether or not the provisions are severable in the legislation. So we will look at it. If the provisions are not severable, meaning if one part is unconstitutional, the entire thing is unconstitutional, then yes, I would drop the defense.
And when you said that you know, the state's budget shouldn't depend on not paying people's pensions that they're promised. Well, everybody says the pensions are the problem, the COLAs are a big problem. So does that mean you're for the tax increase or the service tax increases? Or where do you get the revenue to pay for those things, or what do you cut to pay for those things?
Well, I don't think we're going to solve our budget problems until we get the Illinois' economy going again. I think the key to balancing our budget is to make our economy robust once again. And that's one of the reasons why I am supporting Bruce Rauner for governor. I think he's a good candidate to do that.
Okay, and I don't mean to be tricky on this. Earlier, though, when we were discussing the 401k thing, you said kind of almost as an aside, well, yeah, but if you promise something as an employee and then it changes, that would not be constitutional. Which sounded like going from the defined benefit plan to a 401k plan midstream of your career. So can it not be extrapolated that you said you think the kind of a basic of his plan is not constitutional because of that?
Well, you get points for determination, Bernie, but I'm not going to comment on his plan. I haven't studied it. I have not talked over pensions with Bruce at all. Regarding the income tax, what I will say is, one of my beliefs across the board is the government needs to keep its promises. This was promised as a temporary income tax. It needs to be temporary.
Well, what about some other issues like gun control? You still have people in the Chicago area and the governor trying to take steps to limit access to guns. What are your general thoughts on where we are on that issue?
My general thought on gun control is we need to enforce the laws that we already have. I don't support new gun control legislation. I think Chicago is the example of how we have amongst the most restrictive gun control legislation in the nation, and yet it's still all kinds of problems with gang and gun violence. So I don't think I want to enforce the legislation that we already have.
Let's take your approach to the office. Are you going to be more reactive where issues come up and then you issue a constitutional ruling? Or are you going to be proactive and say, we have Mexican warlords taking over drug distribution in Chicago, we have other things that are going on, and that are you going to be going spread of heroin in the suburbs, where you're going to be proactive in addressing issues without them necessarily coming up as a constitutional issue?
I want to have a proactive Office of the Attorney General. I want an Office of the Attorney General that's actually going to act as a check and balance against some of the excesses of the executive and the legislative branches in this state.
So when you were talking about the severability of the current pension law, what would it be that you would try to determine each element of it, or would you just be looking at whether the COLA could be severable?
I don't think the COLA is salvageable. The other provisions maybe, and if the other, if we can sever the COLA, then I think as a general rule the Attorney General needs to defend the state. If there is an argument that can be made that the legislation is constitutional.
So if the rest of the law is constitutional, then you would defend that?
Yes.
Okay, but if you determine that, or if it's not severable, then the whole thing you'd withdraw?
That's correct. One more question. Nobody wants to ask the last one?
How much money do you have? Oh.
No, that's better.
Yeah, I mean, how's it? She's got like $8 million last I checked. You have, I'm assuming it's less than $500,000? Less than 100? Where are you at?
We have considerably less. We will never be able to compete with the Madigan family in terms of funding. We do anticipate raising enough money to be able to get our message out.
Do you think that a position like this, that this constitutional issue, you're coming down here on the idea that the COLA provision is unconstitutional, do you think that'll help you get union support?
Well, I've before the pensions bill was even passed, I came out and said I thought it was unconstitutional, and I haven't received any support from the unions since then.
I can't remember. Has AFSCME or AFL-CIO or Chicago Federation of Labor or anybody endorsed in your race?
The AFL-CIO endorsed my opponent. All right, thank you all for coming out.
You're watching the Illinois Channel.